Well, the situation in South Sudan is a rather complex one. CGTN's Patrick Oyet has more from Juba.
As far as we know, rebels supporting former Vice President Riek Machar attacked an army position at the weekend. Christopher Allen had been embedded with the rebels for around a week. It's believed 2 other journalists were with him. Who and where they are now remains unclear. Clashes between rebels and government troops are not new. Tens of thousands of people have been killed since violence broke out. More than 2 million are displaced, many into neighboring countries like Uganda. The UN says the refugee crisis is the worst in Africa since the Rwandan genocide in 1994. And UN peacekeepers have been heavily criticized for not doing enough to protect civilians. The UN mission in the country is seeking a more robust mandate to do that. But South Sudanese President Salva Kiir has been downplaying the refugee crisis. His government is also in an ongoing dispute with the UN over a regional peacekeeping mandate. It's a complex crisis with many elements and incredibly dangerous in parts of the country, which begs the question, what was Christopher Allen doing in that situation, and was he briefed about the dangers? Patrick Oyet, CGTN, Juba, South Sudan.
Indeed, several developments there out of South Sudan. Let's get to the UN response now. I'm joined live from New York by our UN correspondent, Liling Tang. Liling, let's start with the death of American journalist Christopher Allen. What's the UN response to that?
Well, the UN Special Envoy for South Sudan and also head of the mission there, UNMISS, has in a statement expressed his regret at the killing of Christopher Allen and also conveyed both his and his mission's condolences to Allen's family and loved ones. Now, in the statement, Shira also highlighted the dangers that journalists face while covering the South Sudan conflict and noted that Allen is the 10th reporter to have been killed since 2012 there. Now, Shira also stressed that attacks on journalists are unacceptable, and he also called on all parties involved in the conflict to respect freedom of the press. And we're still awaiting a response from the UN Secretariat, likely to come later in the day.
Well, the UN mission to South Sudan is aiming for a more robust mandate to protect civilians. How concerned is the UN that the South Sudanese government will block that?
Well, the UN is reasonably concerned now. The UN has come, as we know, for several months now under a lot of criticism over the extent that peacekeepers have been willing to defend and protect civilians. And David Shira, who is relatively new in this position as the envoy, has tried to make a concerted effort to improve the response. Now, we have seen some progress. We are hearing reports from non-UN agencies and witnesses on the ground that they are noticing a difference now in terms of peacekeepers, in terms of how the UN missions peacekeepers have responded. For example, there have been cases where they've defended civilians, prevented abductions. They've also intervened in clashes and enabled aid workers to help intervene in a cholera outbreak. The number of serious crimes like rape and murder have also plummeted. However, as we have heard, there remains resistance from the South Sudanese government, especially when it comes to the deployment of the regional protection force that is being sent there to help assist UNMISS. Especially over Juba airport. Now, we saw this dominating headlines last week in which the South Sudanese government and the UN had exchanged words or had a row over control and security at Juba International Airport. But the United Nations has said that this particularly has been resolved after discussions were held on the ground. So even though the UN is still concerned about further resistance from the South Sudanese government or a lack of cooperation, it does appear that things at this moment are moving along slowly but surely.
Well, Liling, the UN now says, though, that this is the worst humanitarian crisis in Africa since the 1994 Rwandan genocide. So is the UN frustrated at this stage when it comes to getting aid to the people in South Sudan?
Absolutely. The UN is certainly frustrated. And just looking at the latest numbers earlier this morning, the UN's humanitarian response plan just for South Sudan stands at $1.2 billion for the year. But there remains a 35% shortfall, a 35% funding gap. Now, a lot of this is because of the mounting needs, not just from the South Sudanese crises, but also from other conflicts and crises around the world, spread across nearly more than 36 countries. So the needs, the humanitarian needs that the UN is facing has been outpacing the available resources. Now, for South Sudan, the fund does hope to reach about 5.8 million people, but so far only 3.5 has been reached. So yes, for the UN, this has been quite an uphill battle and a very frustrating one.
All right, Li Tang for us there in New York.